It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert, joining you from New York City, where I'm at the 2019 Left Forum, which is actually taking place in Brooklyn this year. And I'm joined by David Harvey, Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Thanks so much, David, for joining us today. So I want to start with the question of neoliberalism, because that's an issue that has been a lot on people's minds here at the Left Forum, it seems to me. And one of the issues regarding neoliberalism seems to be the strange contradiction between, on the one hand, that everybody is saying, and I think the kind of the progressive candidates on the Democratic Party in the United States are kind of bearing this out, the loss of legitimacy of neoliberalism at this point, at least as an ideology, as a mode of thinking. But on the other hand, and this is kind of this contradiction, is the persistence of neoliberalism in its institutionalized form. That is, we have all kinds of structures in place, from the World Bank to the World Trade Organization, the European Union, the new and revamped North American Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's all kinds of different institutions in place that basically institutionalize neoliberalism. And so my question is, how can we get beyond this contradiction in the sense that, what good does it do if neoliberalism has been vanquished on the level of ideas, but it continues on kind of, as some have said, perhaps in a zombie-like form without any real life, but as individual nations, it's almost too difficult to do anything about it, even if a progressive government comes into office. What do you think?
Well, I don't think it's a zombie form. I think it's very active, and for some of the reasons you mentioned, it's become instantiated within many of the institutions, and you mentioned, but we have a global thing with the WTO, which is a neoliberal construct to which everybody is supposed to comply. You have a European Union with Maastricht Accord and Lisbon Accords, which are completely kind of neoliberal in their orientation. Even further than that, I think we have a mindset in which, in a curious kind of way, we have all become neoliberals without knowing it. And even when we kind of object to some of the more egregious activities which are going on, we often look at alternatives in a very neoliberal kind of way. And I think one of the questions I want to ask around here of my colleagues is, to what degree has the left become neoliberalized? Well, I mean, everybody's critical of Clinton and Blair and so on for neoliberalizing the Democratic Party and the Labour parties, but I think it's gone much deeper than that. So it's not gone. And I would point out that if one of the themes of neoliberalism is to deregulate, Trump has deregulated at a rate which is absolutely phenomenal. So that is very, very consistent with a neoliberal project and a deepening of the neoliberal project, as opposed to its sort of rolling it back. The tax bill he gave out was a classic neoliberal document, which was really a bondholder's charter. And I think that actually, in many day-to-day aspects, neoliberalism is alive and active. And I think that the problem, however, is, as you mentioned, its legitimacy. And I think what's happening is there's a curious alliance occurring between right-wing authoritarianism and neoliberalism, which is very, very troubling. And I think that is a very dangerous sign.
I want to return to that point, but before I do, I want to touch on something that you said just before that, which is about how the left might have incorporated some key ideas of neoliberalism. And this is, of course, something that has only been discovered recently, I would say, well, not that recently, in the last 10 years. Neoliberalism has been around, I guess, since the early 1970s. But in the last 10 years, there have been more and more thinkers who've been, and I think partly this might be a result of Michel Foucault's analysis of neoliberalism, talking about how it becomes ingrained in our everyday habits. And the thing that he points to is these ideas about how we become enterprises of our own, of an individual, of a single individual as an enterprise. And I'm wondering, is that related to what you're thinking in terms of the neoliberalization of the left? I mean, make that a little bit more concrete, what you mean by that.
A very good book come out by Cinzia Aruzzo and Titi Bhattacharya and Nancy Fraser on the feminism for the 99%. And one of the things they do is to point out that there's a form of feminism which latched onto neoliberalism precisely because it had this philosophy of entrepreneurialism in the self. And so women could say, okay, I'm doing entrepreneurialism myself, and as an entrepreneur I can ascend in the corporate world. And so you get a kind of corporate feminism, which in many ways is represented by Hillary Clinton, which explains why she didn't do so well amongst many women, because that corporate feminism, which is consistent with neoliberalism, has become quite significant in the feminist movement. And so these authors go against that and say, we have to have an anti-capitalist feminism, which is anti-neoliberal and anti-capitalist. And I think there's a big difference for me, by the way, between an anti-neoliberal politics and an anti-capitalist project. Because neoliberalism is a particular form of capitalism, and the big question is, can you get rid of it and construct an ethical form of capitalism or a social democratic form of capitalism, or do we really need to go beyond capitalism altogether? But I don't think the left, particularly when you look at some of the other issues and the overlap there is in the left with some aspects of an anarchist tradition. And the anarchist tradition is not entirely sort of opposed to some of the neoliberal ideas about liberty and freedom of the individual and the like. So you'll find many aspects of the left these days is sort of characterized by what I would call a non-ideological cultural anarchism. And to some degree that is a little bit what comes out of the neoliberal ethic. When the neoliberal ethic was first being proposed, it seemed to me that it was very much being proposed to the generation of '68 and saying to that generation, look, you want individual liberty and freedom. Okay, we'll give it to you, we'll give it to you. And we'll give it to you in this neoliberal form, which is a very political economic form, and you have to forget other issues like social justice and the like. So it's seeped its way into the discourses of much of the left, and I think that this creates a sort of a tolerance for some neoliberal practices, but though never ideas, which these exist on the left.
Now, returning also to this issue now of the alliance between neoliberalism and conservatism, in a way, I'm wondering if there's a parallel that might be made in the sense that to something that you wrote actually a long time ago when you wrote about the new imperialism. And what I'm thinking of specifically is about, I think you made the distinction between the logic of capital versus the logic of territory, I think it was the alternative. And this neoliberal alliance with conservatism, it follows kind of a logic of territory in some sense, versus you also have among the elites, or among the ruling class, if you will, of a kind of a logic of capital and a kind of this neoliberal, non-conservative neoliberalism and that's represented by the big tech companies, for example, Google and Apple and so on, and Facebook on the one hand. And on the other hand, you've got the kind of Trumpian neoliberalism that is authoritarian. And of course now the left forces seem to be stuck somehow in terms of possibly facing the choice between one of those two or presenting an alternative. And I'm just wondering if what that, so to speak, that other logic might be in terms of what would it be oriented towards, and how would it be able to present a real alternative to this the logic of capital versus logic of territory, the neoliberal versus the neoliberalism, if you will, and the conservative neoliberalism. How can it can this alternative kind of get beyond this dichotomy?
Well, I take it from this perspective that when I read Marx, particularly Volume 1 of Capital, what I see is a system which systematically has the rich growing richer and the poor getting relatively poorer. In other words, a free market economy driven by competition in which there's an equalization of the rate of profit. That kind of economy will produce automatically greater and greater levels of social inequality and of social well-being. And of course, the neoliberal era, all the data show that is exactly what has happened. So you kind of go, okay, I understand theoretically why this is happening. It's because of this mechanism, because that's what this mechanism does, and then I see the data, and then, but that then I think leads to the challenge to the legitimacy of neoliberalism, because the idea behind it is to say to everybody, do entrepreneurial work in yourself and then you'll become rich and all the rest of it. But it turns out that's extremely difficult to do, and for the mass of the population it turns out to be impossible. So they look at this situation and say, this system is not working for me. But then the neoliberal ethic kicks in about entrepreneurialism in the self and says, well, if you're poor, it's because you didn't invest in your own cultural capital. It's your fault that you're poor. So neoliberalism has a very clever way of turning things around and blaming the victim. And we saw that in the foreclosures of the housing and all this kind of stuff. Many people who were foreclosed upon didn't blame the system. What they blamed was themselves. So actually, what neoliberalism does as an ideology is to start to do that. So when somebody kind of says, look, the system's not working for me, the system turns around and says, well, that's because you didn't work on your education, you didn't do right, it's your fault, all this kind of stuff. So it's a very neat way now. When you get to the mid-1990s, or beyond that, I would say sort of around 2000, particularly after the Clinton years, when Clinton came in promising all kinds of benefits and gave us NAFTA and all these neoliberal reforms, and at that point I think people kind of said, you know, this is not really working for me, and what's more, there's something going on here which is not right. So you start to see in the 2000s this kind of alliance between the neocons and the neoconservatives and the authoritarian state, because the only way in which social order could be actually kept was by actually starting to discipline populations. Because after all, the first revolt against the neoliberal order, which was global as opposed to particular, there are lots in Latin America, as I think you know, but the global one was Seattle, which was the anti-globalization movement, and then all of the picketing of the IMF and the G20s meetings and all these kinds of things, Genoa, all of that kind of story. And at that point, I think the ruling classes started to say, well, this is going to get out of hand. We need a government structure that's going to sit on these people and do it really, really hard. So when Occupy Wall Street came along, which was a fairly small and fairly innocent kind of movement, actually, Wall Street got paranoid and basically summoned the New York mayor at the time, who was a Wall Street character, Bloomberg, to say, squash these people. And so then at this point, the perpetuation of the neoliberal order starts to become more and more guaranteed by state authoritarianism and neoconservatism, which now has morphed a little bit into this kind of right-wing populism. So in a sense, the neoliberal order is being perpetuated by this authoritarian shift. And I think, again, that should give the left a good possibility to mount a counterattack. And I think they are in a position to mount a counterattack in certain parts of the world. But right now, I don't think the left has woken up to this moment of possibility.